community worker and indeed partner. By faith, I don't mean absolute certainty about the nature of reality or the absence of doubt about a God, or indeed a set of rules covering every situation, but rather a relationship involving trust and hope. And I think perhaps aspects of my story may resonate with some of the others here, but there'll be plenty of time to talk further in the discussion. Meanwhile, if you think of anything, please do make a note in the chat, as Gillian suggested. I was born in 1962 in Sri Lanka, what was then Ceylon, and migrated to the UK a couple of years later with my parents and older sister and brother. We settled in London. My mother and father were active in the Church of Ceylon, part of that worldwide family of churches known as the Anglican Communion. And here we became part of the Church of England. Like everyone else, they had much to learn, but I owe a lot to them, not only in terms of their care for me, but also avoiding some of the traps of religion. I don't recall ever being taught by them to take the whole Bible literally, and there was an awareness too that love of neighbour included challenging exploitation and prejudice. There was also a sense of the importance of decolonising theology, not that I would have been able to put it in quite that way when I was a small child, but it was about not reading through the lens of the powerful, not taking for granted the kinds of relationships that shaped the way that nations and individuals related to one another. Looking back now, the notion of being loved by a God who's beyond gender, sex or race, and in whose image all humans were made, and invited to be part of a community or movement dedicated to trying to live by those truths, however imperfectly, perhaps strengthened me in the face of society's racism and sexism. But by the time I was about 12, a new challenge was arising. I was increasingly aware that my sexuality was not the same as that of the other girls at school or in my church youth group. I struggled to understand the attraction of boy bands and the male pop stars of that time, the likes of the Bay City Rollers and the Osmonds, or David Cassidy, for those who are old enough to remember or who are interested in retro pop. Or indeed, see the attractiveness of the boys from neighbouring schools whacking each other with their satchels. So it became clear to me that the world of heterosexuality, which seemed to be taken for granted as the way that humans were after a certain age, the pattern of relationships, just didn't fit me, or I didn't fit into it, and that this was not a good thing. In terms of the norms of the society of that day, and certainly what was regarded as acceptable in church circles. These were days when society still treated being lesbian or gay as not normal. Bisexuality wasn't talked about much. Being transgender was probably talked about even less. In fact, being homosexual, as it was largely described then, was regarded as possibly unhealthy. I was about 5 when sex between men was partly decriminalised, but discrimination was still rife. Positive images of LGBT plus people were few and far between. So there might be an occasional person cropping up on TV, perhaps in profile, saying something about this experience, but it wasn't widespread, and those people were almost invariably white when they did appear. Though the gay liberation and feminist movements were opening up some space. Churches almost uniformly taught in those days that the only right place for sex was opposite-sex marriage. This was partly because it was assumed that same-sex relationships were superficial or destructive, though it was becoming increasingly clear that they could be deep and committed as well, that they could in fact have the same range as opposite-sex relationships. I read and reflected more deeply. There weren't nearly as many books around in those days as there are now. And of course, for my generation, there wasn't a chance of accessing information on the internet. But I did and do live close to a library, which is very helpful. So I gradually realised that there was that who I was not anything particularly dreadful, and also that there was little clear guidance in the Bible that precisely fitted my situation. The Bible, seeing the Bible as a library of books by different authors and in different genres, reflecting an encounter between finite and fallible humans and an infinite God. But I did know that the themes of love, justice and mercy throughout were ways of shaping my thinking about some of the human issues and questions I might face in the world today. And as I read more, I realised that the letters of Paul, that influential figure in the early church, whose work or the work of whose followers makes up quite a lot of the New Testament, reflected a distaste for the sexual exploitation and excess of a kind common among the Roman ruling class 2,000 years ago, but it's not clear what he would have thought of equal self-giving partnerships. Above all, though, he was very strongly opposed to legalism, as was the Jesus of the Gospels, indeed whose message was very much about liberation. It was also remarkable that the Bible and early Christian leaders had a great deal to say about economic and social justice, but a lot of the people who were very caught up with what the Bible might have to say on sexuality, perhaps 5 or 6 fairly obscure passages where there were different interpretations and translations, seemed a lot of the time not to notice what appeared to be much more important trends within the Bible that took on the powers that be, that asked searching questions about the way that the world is. So I became reconciled, I think, to who I was, and recognised that I didn't necessarily have to try to change, and that this would be futile anyway, and that I didn't have to be celibate for life in order to live up to the requirements of my faith. And this was a time when organisations like what was then the Gay Christian movement were beginning, around the mid-70s, and across the world, they're in places, other movements and groups and inclusive churches as well. I studied chemical engineering at University College London and came out at university. I think I might have been the only out lesbian in the engineering faculty. I am fairly certain I was the only out LGBT plus person in the chemical engineering department, and certainly was the only out person in the Christian Union. And I think I was lucky because a lot of people had far worse experiences. And I think mine was far more positive than that of others. And in many ways, I have been lucky that maybe some of the people who didn't understand what I was about and didn't agree were maybe willing to stick around and continue to relate to me and listen and learn. Likewise in the church that I attended at home. I became involved in Islington and Haringey Gay Group, and what was then GCM, the Gay Christian Movement, where I began volunteering and writing for the newsletter when I was about 20. I first came across the Lesbian and Gay Black Group while I was on my way to an anti-racist protest, or on my way back from one, and at a coach stop, I think, when on the motorway to Yorkshire. And this was my first encounter with other people of colour, so to speak, who were out LGBT But I wasn't very out in those circles at that time. But it opened up new possibilities for me. This was a time in the early 80s when this movement was beginning to develop within the UK. Black lesbians were beginning to network with one another. Black gays and lesbians were beginning to meet, to provide mutual support and try to change the world and challenge racism and homophobia. I also came to meet Sharon, as she was then known, who was to become involved in Camden Lesbian Centre and Black Lesbian Group and work for that. She was African Caribbean. And in late 1986, we became partners. So I had moved into, I was moving into a world where I was increasingly in contact with a wider range of people. But by this stage, I had begun work for the Black Lesbian and Gay Centre project in 1985. I was one of the first set of workers, an outreach and development worker, and we were trying to set up a centre in London that could be a place providing information, advice and support, and also helping to change views. We provided a lot of support on the telephone and so on initially, and had the occasional event. We were in a rather small space, and it took some years to find anywhere that would be big enough to be called a centre as such. But it was, I think, an important development for many people. And I had also become involved with setting up a Haringey Lesbian and Gay subcommittee, and some workers were appointed to form a lesbian and gay unit. This was a time when local government was changing. There was increasing recognition that equalities were important, equalities across the board, and also a lot of resistance to that. And Haringey became one of the areas that was in the thick of the storm as there was forward movement, including in schools, and then a backlash at a local level, and then it became central to a more national backlash. So all of that was going on. Meanwhile, I was still involved in church circles and in trying to change thinking within the churches. By this stage, a lot of Christians were coming to recognise, a lot of Christian theologians, thinkers were writing about the case for accepting loving and committed same-sex partnerships. There was quite a lot of awareness, I think, on the part of some leaders within churches that it might be a good idea to be more inclusive, but there was also a lot of fear of saying that out loud about the kinds of reactions that there might be. So a lot of debate was going on in various churches across the world, including in the Church of England, and I was becoming involved in some of that. At a more personal level, in 1988, early in the year, Sharon, as she then was, and I had our service of blessing at our local church hall. So we had the service and the reception in the same place, with a minister from the Metropolitan Community Church actually carrying out the ceremony. But members of the local church were quite well represented at the event. My parents and our siblings were there. I think a handful of nieces and nephews, very young at the time. So that was quite a special occasion. It did mean that we weren't able to get to a Stop the Clause demonstration that day, which we hadn't expected to be happening when we'd done all the planning. But this was a time when Clause 28, what was to become Section 28, an attempt by central government under Margaret Thatcher to clamp down on growing responsiveness to LGBT, or lesbian and gay people in local government circles, became law. So when it was introduced into Parliament, there was a lot of debate and anger. and that was part of a broader attempt, I think, in some ways to roll back the tide on equalities. Later, Vijayatara, as she was to be known, would become Buddhist, but that ceremony remained hugely important to me, about celebrating love amidst community, and we continued to share a deep spiritual bond. In 2001, we had a Greater London Authority ceremony. These were the days before civil partnerships, let alone marriage. But it was another way of marking our commitment. And a couple of years later, she was ordained into the Triratna Buddhist order as Vijayatara, though as a sociologist of religion, she still remained Sharon Smith. I was still working in the voluntary sector then. BLGC, the Black, Lesbian and Gay Centre project, like so many others, had run out of funding. There some problems and divisions had developed before then. And my work was increasingly focusing on user and public involvement in health and social care. In the early 2000s, I joined the committee of LGCM, and after a while I became vice chair. I also began writing for Ekklesia, which is a sort of alternative Christian website, think tank, some might say, which explored a range of social issues from a faith-related perspective. And I remain an Ekklesia associate. Vijayatara and I had long been carers, and I had supported her too when she developed mental health issues and for a while was unable to work. My parents were increasingly frail, and we were caring for them, along with support from personal assistance arranged through social services, or rather through direct payments from social services, and other family members. Soon afterwards, she obtained her PhD. Soon after she obtained her PhD, my father died in 2008, and a couple of years later, in 2010, my mother, Vijayatara, and I took her ashes back to Sri Lanka to be buried near his. Towards the end of the year, though, she too became ill, and just in case it was something serious, her GP fast-tracked her for tests. She turned out to have pancreatic cancer, and a few weeks later, in 2011, she died peacefully in St. Joseph's Hospice. This was a difficult time for me in terms of my faith. I mean, for a long time, I've known about the fact that nature could be cruel, as well as the existence of human-made suffering. But for a while, it seemed as if God was largely distant, much of the time, if there at all. And thankfully, after some time, this changed. But I was aware that there were no guarantees, that there's always a clear-cut path through difficult times, or that there will always be a strong sense of God's presence. And I think, again, that's something that many Christians share. It's not a simple matter of having a journey of faith where you kind of sign up at the beginning and you carry on along an even track and then you sign off at the end. Even for those who do not break with the church, and many people have had such bad experiences that they've actually broken with organised religion. I think I've been relatively lucky in that regard. But I think it was important that there was human connection, and that there's perhaps a renewed sense that the love of people is sometimes one of the ways in which we experience the love of God for those of us who believe in God. I suppose it became all the more apparent that I had something precious. It was very difficult to lose that, still is sometimes, but I thought about all the people who had never had that opportunity. They had just believed what they had been told, and then they had not taken up maybe the chance of a loving relationship. and at some point this would become too late, or you might lose that chance with the someone special. So it was a prompt to me about how important it was to get the churches to move forward, and where there was actually a strong sense, because views had been changing in the pews, as well as among people more generally who might regard themselves as Christians. But certainly in the UK, there was by that time probably quite a substantial majority of people who might regard themselves as Christians, including Anglicans, who didn't go along with, say, the Church of England's official position that same-sex partnerships were always wrong, who accepted in many cases that there was value in LGBT plus relationships and identities, but very often churches remain stuck at the institutional level, and so I suppose I threw myself again into that struggle with renewed commitment to trying to get change, including trying to find ways of talking to and reaching those people who were still on the fence about that. From 2014, I think for a couple of years, I served as the chair of LGCM, as it was, the Lesbian and Gay Christian Movement, and this was a time of some change and the usual challenges of being part of any community and voluntary organisation. And then I think I spent another year on the committee, and at this point we were on the path to becoming One Body, One Faith. For a long time we'd had problems with the name. For a start, it could sound a bit as if we were a support group for lesbian and gay Christians, but we were actually open to anybody and everybody who wanted greater inclusion in the churches, who accepted that a same-sex partnership could be a loving and blessed relationship. So, for instance, my dad was a member, though he was heterosexual, but not everybody knew that. Then again, we had a number of members who were bisexual, transgender, or who might identify in other ways with the Q, with queer. So we were trying to make churches more inclusive, but our name could make us appear rather more limited, but we didn't want to end up with a very, very long name with many, many acronyms and nobody being able to remember what all of that meant. So we went back and forth about what we should be called, and should we stay as LGCM and have a long strap line about what we actually did and believed. And then eventually somebody came up with the idea that we change it all together and become One Body, One Faith. So I was part of the board as we worked together on that. It was also an exciting time because Changing Attitude joined with LGCM. So we got more members and more energy at that time. And though we still had the usual financial struggles. And we changed the statement of conviction to reflect that broader understanding of what we were trying to do in terms of making churches more loving and inclusive. So this was a time when I was also involved with Inclusive Church, which covered wider issues of inclusion, particularly in the Church of England. But then I stepped down. I'd been on the board long enough, and I think changes were underway to try to get fresh people in. But I have remained a member, and I think it continues to do important work. I also had a book published by Ekklesia, Sexuality, Struggle and Saintliness, Same-Sex Love in the Church, drawing on some of the writings I had done, the articles that appeared online, but also pulling some of those together and exploring the process of change and the realities beneath the surface of official statements, some of the ways in which action at grassroots level can result in a shift in what happens and what people believe within faith communities, but looking particularly at the church on the issue of sexuality. I think that was one of the many things that I learnt from Vijayatara about examining faith communities as being perhaps reflective of something transcendent, something at a deep spiritual level, but also communities of humans, organisations that reflect some of the differences and opportunities for struggle and change that other organisations, institutions and movements have. So, this reflected from various dimensions on what it was actually like to be in the midst of that process of change, and how different things might be happening in different places. Some of the theological issues, some of the issues about how humans might relate to God, if there is a God, and how humans relate to one another and the meaning of life, alongside the practicalities of church and national politics, and how people actually reason and change their minds. And these are issues that I have carried on exploring in my writing. I've continued to write and campaign in between doing other things, being involved in, for instance, as a chair of another organisation, a disabled people's organisation focusing on domestic abuse and hate crime in East London and beyond. And continuing to work in user and public involvement in health and social care, though now as a patient and public involvement coordinator for a university-based research organisation or network. And in recent years, I've been writing for a largely evangelical readership in what's known as the Church of England newspaper, though it's not an official newspaper. As well as, I suppose, faith being part of my everyday life and being part of a congregation and taking part in the activities of that and experiencing online worship for the first time in my life. So the opportunities to learn new things all the time in various aspects of life, including within faith-based circles. And looking back on with deep thankfulness at those 24 years that I had with Vijayatara, though not nearly enough. Okay, so I've said a little bit about my journey of faith and how it's tied in with my sexuality. So maybe I'll hand over to Gillian and we can open things up to questions.
Well, thank you very much, Savi. And thank you so much for sharing your life with us. So we'll open up the floor now to questions, and we do have one in the chat. It's from Ray Steels. So I'll just read it out and you can answer it. So how much of an impact do you feel you had in the church regarding lesbian and gay issues in the early days, like in the 1970s and 1980s?
Right. I mean, I think personally, I think it will probably fairly limited impact, but I think together, together there was quite a major impact in shifting thinking. Now, I wasn't involved in those sorts of things in the early 1970s. When it was 1970, I was 8 years old, and I hadn't yet figured out. I think it might have been not impossible to guess for some other people that I might not be easily slotting into a sort of conventional heterosexual role, but certainly I had no inkling of that. But by the mid-70s, I was, I think, vaguely aware that those things were going on. And by the beginning of the 80s, I had become part of that movement. And I think there was quite a significant shift. So actually having people who were out, and obviously not everybody can or should be out. There can be all kinds of constraints and risks that different people face, whether it's risks to their jobs or emotional risks. Some people are reliant on other family members or communities who may not always be accepting. And church leaders can be okay about, for instance, having clergy who are out in a sort of private or semi-private way, but they don't want people to know. But for those of us who can and who can be, that was important. So it became increasingly difficult to marginalise us. And also the arguments were more widely shared. So that was important, I think.
Okay, thank you. Got a question. The next question is from Florence Hayworth. Did you ever feel judgment from others in the LGBT plus community regarding your faith?
Yes, some people are very negative. I haven't had nearly as much negativity as some people have had, but some people are understandably sceptical, and they have had bad experiences with the church. And some people perhaps think of the church as a kind of uniform block, when it's actually much more diverse. And there are now quite a lot of churches, including parts of the Anglican Communion, which are far more accepting and inclusive. But probably everyone has some way to go. So yes, sometimes, occasionally.
Okay. The next question is from Hayley. How far away from equal marriage do you think the Church of England is?
Yes, this is an interesting one, because that's been that's been a major focus of my efforts in recent years. But it is a huge challenge. I think that there is quite a lot of backing for equal marriage in sections of the church, but I think that in the leadership of the Church of England, the bishops in particular are very risk averse, and they tend, on all kinds of equalities issues, to focus on the people who find equalities hardest, rather than the people who are most frustrated at lack of progress. So I'm not sure how long it will take. I think with the new General Synod, which will be voted in the next year or so, there might be a shift, but we'll have to see.
Okay. The next question is from Ruby. What do you feel informs your thinking and your work? Is it your cultural identity, your sexual politics, or your faith tradition? And do you or can you prioritise them?
I think they're all interconnected. Mm-hmm. So I think faith is something of a bedrock, or a base, or whatever, in the sense of that sense of connectedness with who I believe is the love at the heart of the universe, and in some ways that's more fundamental. Whereas cultural identity is something that in some ways keeps changing. So it's different from the identity I would have had as a small child in Sri Lanka, or even the way I experienced who I was as I began to come to terms with being a BME British person in the 70s or late 60s or 70s and so forth. And sexual politics, again, is an area where I suppose I've changed and grown, and others continue to do so. But also my understanding of faith has hopefully changed since I was a small child, and will hopefully keep changing and developing during my life. So it's prioritising things is very difficult, because, and as I said, though I would say faith is in some ways fundamental, and that entails a commitment to justice for everybody, and an attempt to, or a belief, I suppose, in the importance of love and mercy and compassion, even if I might find it quite difficult to put that into practice a lot of the time. How I think about that is inevitably informed by the realities around me, who I am, my neighbourhood, my family and friends.
Okay. Hayley has got a question for you. She says, I would love to bring some of your thinking into my church in Leicestershire. Is there any advice you can give me to do that beyond continued dialogue?
I think it depends on where things are with that church, and what the baseline is. Are there allies within that congregation who have got, I suppose, a strong voice, strong connections, people who could persuade and encourage others? Is there local network that can provide support around that? Maybe bring somebody else in to speak about that if there are openings. I mean, it sometimes depends on what the ministers are like and how ready they are. I'm not sure whether you're part of that sort of leadership team in that church, but having one or two people within that who can help to provide support can be very helpful. But again, it may be worth reaching out to organisations and networks, whether it's something like One Body, One Faith, or networks within particular denominations, so among Methodists, Baptists, the Church of England, finding ways of pitching the arguments that reach those people, because, say, Roman Catholics might respond in different ways to Baptists, so it might be choosing the approach that works best for that congregation, and getting support when you're doing it, because otherwise it can be quite a lonely and draining thing to go through.
Okay, thank you. Adam says, thank you for sharing your story. As a Christian, I'm trying to have more conversations about my faith and inclusive sexual politics with others, especially in the church. Are there any good places in the Bible where I can start to build my knowledge on this further?
I think it might be useful to look at some of the books and articles that have appeared. And now there are a wide range of resources. There are some online resources in spaces like Christians for LGBTI plus Equality, and other Facebook groups, probably on other social media, sometimes on the websites of organisations like One Body, One Faith. So those are good links for looking at some of the books that examine the Bible more deeply, and some of what's inclusive within the Bible. And different people will have different books that they find particularly helpful and persuasive, and some of those are written for a wide audience, and some of them are are harder for people who aren't grounded as theologians. I mean, some of them I wrestle with, but if they're really good, sometimes I'll just carry on and get at least about 3/4 of what the person is saying. So I think there are a very wide range of resources now about the Bible and inclusion. But I mean, I think that fundamental notion of all humankind being made in the divine image, that picture, Jesus' message of love for all, and example of breaking down barriers, the image that Paul offers in his letters of a body where the different parts are all equal, and for me that was an important reminder that society's way of thinking that everybody has to be in a hierarchy, so sometimes heterosexual people are afraid that if LGBT people are fully accepted, then they become less important. It brings them down in status, but moving beyond being competitive in status games, so that there's that range of resources and books and articles that could be useful, and it's sort of choosing those. I mean, I don't know whether and I should really have got a bit of a list together, but I can probably come up with some examples afterwards, or type something in.
We could probably share that with the people who are here. Okay. 2 more questions. Florence says, as a young person, did you have any role models who were both LGBT plus and religious, which helped you in reconciling the different aspects of your identity?
I don't think I did. I mean, not when I was a not when I was a teenager. I'm trying to remember now. Not until I was in my late teens, I should say. So I think having members of the gay Christian movement, as it initially was, that quite soon became the lesbian and gay Christian movement after I joined, was important. But I'm trying to think of role models when I was younger. So I knew some people who were gay or lesbian, but I don't think they were religious in that way. And I probably did know quite a lot of religious people who were LGBT plus, but I didn't know that at the time. Just to say, if people have comments as well, that's fine as well, as well as questions.
Okay. Ray says, you mentioned your early involvement in the Black Lesbian and Gay Centre. What drew you from race and sexual politics and into involvement more with the church and sexual politics?
Okay, I think that some of those things happened more or less simultaneously. So, I suppose like a lot of people who were of Asian or African or Latin American descent growing up in Britain in the 1960s and 70s, it took time to be more confident about my identity, to feel good about being different in that way, at a time when there was a lot of open prejudice, and there still is a lot of prejudice. It's gone back and forth. And in the early to mid 70s, I suppose, I became both more active in anti-racist campaigning and also involved in some of the initiatives within the church to raise issues about race. And this was quite an explosive subject. So I can remember some fairly heated discussions. I became involved in my mid-teens in helping to plan and coordinate a series of discussions in my local parish church. And I think it was important that we did it, but I think I hadn't anticipated quite how hot a topic it could be. I mean, this was something my parents were also taking up in various ways. So it was, so I suppose I became involved in action around race equality in the churches before I became involved in activity around sexuality. But then I suppose in the 80s, I was, from the early 80s, I was quite heavily involved in both. And I think there are some overlapping issues, though, of course, each has its own particular nuances, and there are different ways in which different people experience exclusion.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think we'll call it, we've got time for one more question. Has anyone got any more questions? Or shall we call it a day? So coming up to time. No more questions? Well, thanks very much for joining us, and thanks, Savi, for sharing your life with us. I'm very pleased that we've recorded it. So do look on our website for future events that are happening, that Ekklesia are hosting, and lots of thank yous are coming in now, Savi. So thank you very much. And I think you need a drink now, don't you? Also, could people say where they found out about the event? And because that will really help us with events that we put on. Yeah, lots of thank yous. And Ruby says excellent. Vicky, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much, Savi. Thank you.
And I know that there are some people here who have done their share of contributing to the process of change. So just acknowledging that as well as those who aren't with us.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you.
And for coming along, to everybody who came along today.
Yeah, thank you for the great questions too.
Just to say, I'm going to finish the event now, so if anybody wants to add more things in, please just do in the chat over the next 30 seconds.